In this video, I'm going to analyze the pronunciation of a subscriber who very kindly responded to my request for a recording from a native Spanish speaker from Spain. Her name is Sarah, and this is the information she has provided about herself. She's 21 years old, and she is a university student in Barcelona. Her mother tongue is Spanish, although she also speaks perfect Catalan, a related Romance language that's the historical language of Catalonia, one of the autonomous regions of Spain. She says she lives in central Catalonia, and she feels that her accent is very standard for the Spanish of Spain, similar to the accent one hears on the TV news. Now, as I listen to Sarah's accent, I do hear many features that are standard for Spain, just as Sarah suggests. But I also hear a few features that are specific to the Spanish of Catalonia, features that are assumed by most authors to be the result of contact with Catalan. And I also hear some features that strike me as non-standard for Spanish, but that, as far as I know, aren't typical of Catalonian Spanish. Something that struck me as very interesting was that, to my ear, many of these later two categories of pronunciation patterns diminished or even disappeared when she was relating her personal story and speaking more casually. All right, before we listen to her recording, let me tell you what I heard in her pronunciation to prepare your ears so you can be listening for the same things. Normal for Spain. Number 1, theta. As is standard for most dialects of Spanish in Spain today, Sarah pronounced Z's and soft C's as theta. She pronounced cocina, intención, empezó, and esperanza as cocina, intención, empezó, and esperanza. Number 2, apical S. Sarah's S is a very good example of the Northern Spanish apical S. Latin American S is very much like the S of American English, but the apical S of Northern Spain has a different point of articulation and produces a different sound. For me, Peninsular apical S has a different pitch and sounds more whistly than the S of Latin American Spanish. Compare my pronunciation of S in these phrases with Sarah's. Si conseguía entrar.
Si conseguía entrar.
Si conseguía entrar.
Si conseguía entrar.
Un montón de gusanos.
Un montón de gusanos.
Un montón de gusanos.
Un montón de gusanos.
I hope you can hear how Sarah's S differs from mine. If you don't hear it here, listen carefully to how she pronounces it in her recording. Number 3, J and soft G is a velar fricative. Sarah's J and G before E and I is not quite as posterior and guttural as I've heard in some parts of Spain, but it's definitely more posterior than is typical for Latin America. Listen to how Sarah pronounces her J's and G's in phrases like these.
Justo cuando pasaba por debajo del viejo melocotonero. Justo cuando pasaba por debajo del viejo melocotonero. Toda la magia. Toda la magia.
Number 4, deaffrication of ch to ts. One thing I was really hoping Sarah would do in this recording was demonstrate how Spaniards soften or deaffricate the ch sound, pronouncing it something like ts. And she did. While she pronounced the ch of echar and dicho with standard pronunciation, she pronounced the ch of hacha more like ts.
Agarró el hacha. Agarró el hacha.
Number 5, S before trilled R. Although Sarah's dialect is non-S reducing, in this recording she did reduce S in one position, and that was immediately preceding trilled R. Listen for her to essentially omit the S in this word.
Uno de sus pies resbaló. Uno de sus pies resbaló.
A couple of observations about sounds that vary a lot around the Spanish-speaking world, and I just want to point out how Sarah did them. Number 6, double L and Y. I heard Sarah pronounce double L and Y 3 different ways in this recording. Sometimes she pronounced them y, much like the English Y sound.
Llevaría a cabo. Llevaría a cabo. Ya nunca podría recuperarlas. Ya nunca podría recuperarlas. Ya sea microbio. Ya sea microbio.
Sometimes as a voiced palatal fricative.
¿Y qué pasará si llegan? ¿Y qué pasará si llegan?
And sometimes as a kind of voiced palatoalveolar affricate.
Y cayó de bruces. Y cayó de bruces. Tierra de aquella forma. Tierra de aquella forma. De echarse a llorar. de echarse a llorar. Cuando oyó un grito asustado.
On one occasion, she applied this same affricate pronunciation to the IE diphthong at the beginning of the word yerba, pronouncing it something like yerba. This is nothing unusual, though. The phonetic conversion from ye to ye at the beginning of a word is very common in all Spanish dialects I know of. Interestingly, I observed one case where she pronounced double L differently in two words side by side. It was in this phrase, which she pronounced something like aquella maravillosa bolsa. Number 7. Omitting word final D. In standard Spanish, word final D is pronounced as an interdental fricative. So these words are pronounced autoridad, verdad, amistad, and Madrid. It's my understanding that in Catalonian Spanish, word final D is sometimes pronounced as if it were a T. And as we discussed in a previous video, people from north-central Spain often pronounce word final D as theta. In this recording, there was only one word that ended in D, and Sarah pronounced it with the final D omitted. So she pronounced infelicidad like infelicidad. This type of reduction of word final D is also extremely common in both Spain and Latin America. Sounds specific to Catalonian Spanish. Number 1. Rounded L. Probably the sound most stereotypical of Catalonian Spanish, and one that's attributed to contact with the Catalan language, is a darker and more rounded L. Some of the time, Sarah's L sounded perfectly normal to me, a typical high, bright Spanish L. But sometimes it sounded a bit darker, and sometimes a lot darker, almost like a W sound. Funny enough, the more I listened to her recording to pick out examples, the more normal her L's sounded to me. But no matter how much I listened to them, these 3 examples continue to sound dark and round.
Que estaba en medio del jardín. Se abrió al golpear el suelo. Para agarrar algunas.
I hope you can hear that these don't sound like typical Spanish L's. Number 2. Voiced S. Maybe the second most oft-cited feature of Catalonian Spanish is voicing of S. Now, in standard Spanish, S may be voiced when it precedes a voiced consonant. Catalonian Spanish is known for even sometimes voicing S between vowels. In this recording, Sarah consistently voiced her S's in a manner that sounded perfectly normal to me. There was only one word in which I felt she voiced S particularly strongly, and that was in this word.
Pero sucedió exactamente lo mismo.
But I've observed lots of Spanish speakers from dialects around the world voice this S this way, and my sense is that there was nothing unusual about the way Sarah did it. Number 3. Diphthongs as hiatuses. Another thing that's reported in Catalonian Spanish is the breaking up of diphthongs into hiatuses, especially rising diphthongs. To my ear, Sarah only did this once in the whole reading, in this word, which is normally pronounced as 2 syllables, abrió, but which Sarah pronounced as 3, abrió.
La bolsa de papel se abrió.
Number 4. The letter V as the labiodental fricative, v. Some varieties of Catalan preserve the V phoneme, and in those regions the distinction between V and B is transferred into the local dialect of Spanish. I did observe Sarah pronounce V as V in a few phrases, so she pronounces these phrases something like atravesó volando, se desvió para evitarlas, and y a lo lejos vio. But it's hard to know if she did this because of Catalan influence. As I've explained in previous videos, language arts teachers in Spanish-speaking countries have kept alive the idea that B and V are pronounced differently. And native speakers all over the world do occasionally pronounce V as V, especially when reading. Things that struck me as non-standard or just different from what I expected. Number 1. Vowel reduction. In this recording, Sarah occasionally reduces vowels in certain positions. Now, at no point does she engage in English-style vowel reduction and turn unstressed vowels into schwas, but she does shorten the duration of vowels, sometimes to the point of nearly omitting them completely. She does this in the middle of utterances, sometimes with vowels that would normally form diphthongs, and at the end of utterances. So she pronounces la intención, something like l'intención. Cielo santo pensó, something like cielo santo pensó. And James se levantó, something like James levantó. I've heard similar vowel reduction at the end of utterances in Andean dialects influenced by indigenous languages, pronouncing, for example, hermanito, something like hermanito. Number 2, strong interdental D. There were several places where Sarah's interdental D sounded stronger or more emphatic than I expected. Here are some examples demonstrating what I'm talking about. I'll pronounce each example first, demonstrating how my intuition tells me these Ds normally sound, and I'll follow that with Sarah's pronunciation. Antes de que fuera demasiado tarde.
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 A punto de tocarlas.
A punto de tocarlas.
A punto de tocarlas.
A punto de tocarlas.
En el interior de la tierra.
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 Se levantó del suelo.
Se levantó del suelo.
Se levantó del suelo.
Se levantó del suelo.
I'm not aware of this being a component of Catalonian Spanish pronunciation, but I suppose it could be. I'd love it if someone knowledgeable in peninsular Spanish dialects could weigh in on this. Of course, there's nothing phonetically inaccurate about Sarah's pronunciation here. She's still pronouncing these Ds as interdental fricatives. It's just that to my ear, she's pronouncing them strongly or emphatically. She pronounces other Ds in this recording perfectly normally. Number 3, G as a voiced velar fricative. To my ear, Sarah pronounced the G phoneme with a bit more fricative quality than normal in a few instances. In all positions except after the N sound, Spanish G is normally pronounced as a voiced velar approximant. This means that the back of the tongue comes very close to touching the soft palate without quite making contact. And Sarah pronounces it that way most of the time, but in a few instances she pronounced it as a voiced velar fricative, meaning that she forced a bit of air between the back of the tongue and the soft palate, producing audible turbulence. So she pronounced las ortigas, something like las ortigas. Empezó a gatear, something like empezó a gatear. And agarró el hacha, something like agarró el hacha. Random stuff. And just like everyone, non-natives and natives alike, Sarah's reading had a handful of little random things that I don't think mean anything. Alright, with that introduction, let's listen to Sarah's recording. As we listen and read along, I'll identify those elements of her pronunciation that correspond with something I've said with a color-coded circle. That way listeners can see if their observations match mine. There's one sound we've discussed that I won't identify with a circle, and that's apical S. There are just too many of them, and circling them all would clutter up the screen. Besides, it's all of them. Just listen to how Sarah pronounces all of her S's. Alright, let's listen.
Un momento más tarde, James volvía hacia la casa corriendo cuanto podía. Llevaría a cabo toda la operación en la cocina, pensó, si conseguía entrar sin que lo vieran la tía Sponge y la tía Spiker. Estaba terriblemente excitado. Atravesó volando, más que corriendo, la alta hierba y las ortigas, sin preocuparse de sus picaduras, y a lo lejos vio a la tía Sponge y a la tía Spiker sentadas en sus mecedoras, de espaldas a él. Se desvió para evitarlas, con la intención de entrar por el otro lado de la casa. Pero de pronto, justo cuando pasaba por debajo del viejo melocotonero que estaba en medio del jardín, uno de sus pies resbaló y cayó de bruces en la hierba. La bolsa de papel se abrió al golpear el suelo y las miles de cositas verdes se desparramaron en todas direcciones. James se puso 4 patas inmediatamente y empezó a buscar sus preciados tesoros. Pero, ¿qué era lo que estaba pasando? Se estaban hundiendo en el suelo. Pudo ver perfectamente cómo se revolvían y retorcían al abrirse camino en la dura tierra, y sin pérdida de tiempo estiró la mano para agarrar algunas antes de que fuera demasiado tarde, pero desaparecieron justo debajo de sus dedos. Trató de agarrar otras, pero sucedió exactamente lo mismo. Empezó a gatear frenéticamente en un intento desesperado de agarrar las que todavía quedaban, pero fueron demasiado rápidas para él. Cada vez que las puntas de sus dedos estaban a punto de tocarlas, desaparecían en el interior de la tierra, y pronto, en cuestión de segundos, todas sin excepción, habían desaparecido para siempre. A James le entraron ganas de echarse a llorar. Ya nunca podría recuperarlas. Las había perdido para siempre. Pero, ¿a dónde habrían ido? ¿Y por qué motivo habrían tenido tanta prisa en meterse en la tierra de aquella forma? ¿Qué andarían buscando? Allá abajo no había nada, nada excepto las raíces del viejo melocotonero y un montón de gusanos, 100 pies e insectos que habitaban en la tierra. ¿Qué era lo que había dicho el anciano? El primero que encuentren, ya sea microbio, insecto, animal o árbol, recibirá toda la magia. Cielo santo, pensó James, ¿qué va a pasar ahora si encuentran un gusano? ¿O un 100 pies? ¿O una araña? ¿Y qué pasará si llegan hasta las raíces del melocotonero? Triste y lentamente, el pobre James se levantó del suelo y se fue a la leñera. Oh, si no se hubiera caído y desparramado aquella maravillosa bolsa. Toda esperanza de una vida más feliz se había desvanecido. Hoy, mañana y al día siguiente, y los otros días no habría más que castigos, dolor, infelicidad y desesperación. Agarró el hacha e iba a empezar a partir leña otra vez cuando oyó un grito a sus espaldas, que le hizo detenerse y mirar. Antes de empezar con la historia propiamente dicha, para poner un poco de contexto, creo que debería decir que vivo en una casa en las afueras de un pueblecito y que mi madre siempre me ha transmitido su amor por la naturaleza. ¿Sabéis los típicos críos que se pasan el día maravillándose con cada criatura viviente que se cruzan? Pues yo era así de niña. Dicho esto, ya podemos empezar con la historia como tal. Pasó hará unos 4 o 5 años. Estaba en casa acompañada por un amigo y se coló una libélula hermosísima a la par que enorme y evidentemente intentamos sacarla, ya que por mucho que te gusten los animales, normalmente no quieres que tu casa se convierta en un zoológico. No sé si habréis tenido que lidiar con muchas libélulas en vuestra vida, pero intentar atrapar a una sin matarla es tremendamente difícil por lo rápidas que son. Estuvimos un rato intentando atraparla entre los dos sin mucho éxito, hasta que llegó un momento en que, por algún motivo, yo sentí que debía levantar las manos como quien hace una ofrenda al cielo, y así lo hice. Entonces la libélula dio unas 3 vueltas en círculo por encima de mis manos y luego se posó en ellas mientras mi amigo se quedaba mirándome con la boca abierta. Me abrió la puerta y pudimos sacar a la libélula fácilmente. Quizá sea una historia un poco difícil de creer, pero yo aquel día recordé la sensación que tenía cuando era niña y todo me fascinaba. Llegué a la conclusión de que la magia se esconde en la naturaleza y en esos pequeños momentos en los que sigues a tu instinto y ocurren cosas que no puedes explicar. Y creo que eso es precioso.
I have to confess that the first time I heard someone speaking Catalonian Spanish, because of the rounded L's, voiced S's, and other features, my intuition told me I was not listening to a native Spanish speaker, but maybe someone who'd moved to Spain as a child and somehow retained a few tiny features of their first language or something. I soon realized that most everyone from Catalonia has some of these features, at least to some degree, even when Spanish is their native language. Of course, this is because Catalonian Spanish does have some non-standard features that are a consequence of contact with the Catalan language. And this is the case with many dialects of Spanish around the world where the population is bilingual. The regional dialect of Spanish is influenced by the underlying local language. This is a fascinating part of the diversity of Spanish dialects. All right, so what ranking does Sarah get on the scale? Well, like all native Spanish speakers, she gets a 10. She speaks her native dialect perfectly authentically, something no one can do who isn't a native speaker. I'd like to end this video by sincerely thanking Sarah for her collaboration. If you've enjoyed this video or learned something from it, please give it a like and share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content.